A 2012 genetic study tested DNA from more than 2,000 men across North Carolina and Louisiana. One result stood out. Men in the study who identified as African American and Cajun had genomes that were mostly European. The number was 53%, more than the African ancestry they carried. Every population researchers study in the American South follows the same genetic pattern, about 73% African ancestry, 24% European, and under 1% Native American. That's the national baseline, confirmed by a 2015 study of 23andMe customers. It holds up almost everywhere, except in this one corner of Louisiana where the ratio flipped entirely. This was a small, tight-knit group. They had lived in the same handful of Louisiana parishes for 300 years. Their appearance was so racially mixed that census takers had been confused by them for 100 years. This is the story of the Louisiana Creole genome. Their DNA broke the American racial model. It survived 100 years of laws trying to erase it. Today, we'll cover three things: who they are, where their ancestry really came from, and the hidden lineage still written into their DNA today. Before we get into it, hit subscribe. Every week we break down a story just like this one, a single genetic study, a rewrite of what we thought we knew about American history. Sometimes the rewrite comes from a legal system. Sometimes it's a colonial border or a single ship's passenger list. This channel shows you exactly how, with the proof. That 73% African, 24% European baseline came almost entirely from British colonial law. The plantation system in the pre-Civil War South created that European mix in one specific way: European fathers, African mothers. There was a legal rule behind it called partus sequitur ventrum. That's a Latin phrase. It simply means a child's legal status followed its mother's status. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, no matter who the father was. That rule created only two legal categories: free or enslaved, nothing in between. Louisiana ran on a different system. From 1699 to 1763, it was French territory. From 1763 to 1802, it was Spanish. Both France and Spain used a legal system called Latin civil law. The rest of the colonies used English common law instead. That one difference changed everything that came after. In 1724, France put a law in place called the Code Noir, or Black Code. This law legally recognized manumission, the process of freeing someone from slavery. It gave freed people of color real property rights and real social standing. In French, they were called gens de couleur libres. That simply means free people of color. Freed people in the British colonies had nothing like that. Later, under Spanish rule, enslaved people gained an even stronger right, called coartación. Under this law, an enslaved person could legally earn wages and use that money to buy their own freedom. Even if their owner objected, a court could force the sale at a fair price. This right grew the free population of color quickly, especially in New Orleans. All of this happened decades before the United States ever owned Louisiana. Then, in 1809, the population shifted again. Over 10,000 refugees fled the Haitian Revolution and arrived in New Orleans in a single wave. About 3,000 were white colonists, another 3,000 were free people of color, and roughly 4,000 were enslaved people from the Caribbean. This wave doubled the city's population almost overnight. It added a huge, concentrated Caribbean genetic signal to the city. New Orleans was already unlike anywhere else in the American South. On top of these laws sat a social custom called plaçage. It was a formal relationship between a wealthy European man and a free woman of color. Her mother often approved the match herself, sometimes even in writing. Families repeated this pattern generation after generation. That's one reason French fatherline DNA shows up in Creole DNA today at 30 to 40%. Scientists call this genetic marker haplogroup R1b. That's far higher than random contact could ever produce. But the most surprising part of Louisiana's story happened even earlier, on the African side. Historian Gwendolyn Midlow Hall wrote about this in her book, Africans in Colonial Louisiana. Between 1719 and 1731, more than half of everyone enslaved in Louisiana, 57%, came from one single region, Senegambia in West Africa. The British colonies pulled enslaved people from dozens of different African ports over 200 years. Louisiana pulled from one tight region, one dense founding group. That founding group built an entire world of its own inside French Louisiana. In 1845, 17 free men of color in New Orleans published a book of poetry called Les Sennelles. It was the first poetry collection by writers of color published in the United States. They wrote it entirely in French. This happened 80 years before the Harlem Renaissance. One of the writers, Victor Séjour, became a celebrated playwright. That same community later produced Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth, better known as Jelly Roll Morton, one of the founders of jazz. Morton said early jazz depended on what he called the Spanish tinge, a rhythm he picked up directly from Creole households. Archaeologists later dug up an old Creole homestead at Conne River in Natchitoches Parish. It belonged to a freed enslaved woman named Marie-Thérèse Coincoin. They found West African building techniques and handmade pottery there. It was physical proof that this community was building its own world long before any scientist ever tested their DNA. But there was more. That 53% figure from the opening came from this same study, led by Dr. Lara Suchiston, once she broke Louisiana down by how people identified themselves. African Americans in Louisiana who didn't claim a specific ethnicity had 89% African ancestry and 9.5% European. That's close to the normal Southern pattern. People who identified specifically as Creole had 21% European ancestry, more than double their neighbors. And within that same African American group, the people who identified as Cajun were the ones carrying that reversed 53% European genome. Researchers expected small differences. Instead, they found a group whose European ancestry traced back to France and Spain. Their African ancestry came from one tight region, unlike the scattered West African ports behind most African American DNA. But there was more. Even their African ancestry didn't behave like the rest of the countries. The Family Tree DNA Louisiana Creoles DNA project studied maternal DNA lines called haplogroups. They found one, called L2C, that comes almost only from Senegambia, the region covering modern Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. They found two more, called L1B and L1C, tied to Bantu-speaking people from Congo and Angola. That's far more precise than the typical African American genetic profile. Most African American DNA is spread across the whole West African coast. This made no sense under the old model. Then, researchers checked the old shipping records. The French had deliberately picked enslaved people from the Bambara ethnic group from inland Senegambia. The Bambara were experts at growing rice and processing indigo dye. These specific West African experts engineered Louisiana's entire farming economy. That expert genetic signature still shows up today. On modern DNA tests, Louisiana Creoles often see Senegal or Mali at 15% to 25%. That's a concentration almost nobody else in the U.S. sees. Now compare that to the Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands. They're another isolated, enslaved Southern group from the same era, but one shaped entirely by British law. Their genetic profile is about 91% African and 8% European, a highly isolated genome with very little mixing. Same continent, same country, same general era of slavery. But the genetic result was completely different because the legal system controlling each group was completely different. This contrast is the clearest proof we have. Specific French and Spanish laws created Louisiana's genetic pattern. Only one answer fit the evidence, and it came from a continent nobody expected. The Native American thread in the Creole genome is a real, confirmed lineage, passed down through the mother's side. During the early French colonial period, there weren't enough European women in Louisiana, so French settlers formed relationships with Native American women from the Chitimacha, Attakapas, Natchez, and Choctaw nations. Their children were legally called Creoles. That maternal DNA, carried in genetic markers called haplogroup A2 and haplogroup B2, still survives in Creole DNA today. For some of these native nations, it's almost the only trace left of them at all. A 2014 study went even further. Researchers Cecil Brown, Søren Wichmann, and David Beck published it in a linguistics journal. They found a family link between the Chitimacha language of southern Louisiana and a language family from Mesoamerica called Totozoquean. That suggests people were crossing the Gulf of Mexico by boat before Columbus ever arrived. This rewrites everything we assumed about how isolated Gulf Coast populations really were. But even this wasn't the full story. There was one more discovery, and it was the strangest of all. Everyone expected French ancestry here, but testing of father-line DNA, called Y chromosome testing, turned up something nobody expected. Deep in the swamps of southern Louisiana, researchers found a genetic marker called QL245. This marker traces back to ancient Sephardic Jewish paternal lines from the Middle East. It dates all the way back to the Bronze Age. This marker entered Creole DNA through settlers from the Canary Islands, called Isleños. Spanish Governor Bernardo de Galvez recruited them between 1778 and 1783. Historical research from the Los Isleños Heritage and Cultural Society shows many of these settlers were descendants of Sephardic conversos. These were Jews who were forced to convert to Catholicism during the Spanish Inquisition. Centuries earlier, they had fled to the Canary Islands to escape persecution. That paternal lineage survived the Inquisition. It crossed the ocean twice. It settled quietly under a Spanish last name in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana. This is the ghost layer of Creole DNA. It's never fully solved. There's no complete paper trail linking every Isleño family to one specific converso ancestor. All we have is the genetic signature itself. It sits in the DNA of people who had no idea it was there. And here is where the story gets even more haunting. This ghost lineage lives inside a group that is slowly disappearing. The Louisiana Creole language is called Kouri-Vini. Fewer than 6,000 to 10,000 people can still speak it fluently. That number is small enough that the language could disappear within one generation. The clearest proof of how hard this group was pushed to vanish sits on one woman's desk in downtown New Orleans. Naomi Ruth Mason Drake ran New Orleans' Bureau of Vital Statistics from 1949 to 1965. That's the office that keeps official birth and death records. Drake kept a race list of 250 French and Spanish Creole last names. She thought these families might be secretly passing as white. Her office pulled their birth certificates. Then they dug through family records going back 4 or 5 generations. If they found any non-white ancestor, Drake changed the family's official race on the spot. She didn't have to tell them. They had no right to appeal. This went on for years. Public anger finally grew so strong that 70 witnesses testified against her. She was fired in 1965. By then, her office was holding over 4,700 birth certificates hostage. It was also holding 1,100 death certificates. Her office refused to release them to the families who needed them. Today, somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people actively call themselves Louisiana Creole. That's just a small share of everyone who actually carries this 3-part genetic signature. Younger generations are moving to cities and blending in. That signature is being watered down into the wider black and white group. We're still working out the full meaning of Creole DNA, and the community carrying it is running out of time. There's one defining chapter in how this population got legally erased, the story of Homer Adolphe Plessy. In 1892, Plessy was a 30-year-old Creole shoemaker. He was 7/8 European and 1/8 African. A group called the Comité des Citoyens picked him to challenge segregation in court, so he deliberately sat in a whites-only train car in New Orleans. The case went to the Supreme Court. In 1896, the court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was legal. That ruling erased Louisiana's official third racial category completely. It forced a group that was legally three-part white, black, and Creole into a system with only two boxes. There was no room left for them. That two-box system only got stricter over the next 100 years. In 1970, Louisiana passed House Bill 114. This law legally defined anyone with 1/32 or more African ancestry as black. In 1982, a woman named Susie Guillory Phipps sued the state. Her birth certificate listed her as black based on just 3/32 African ancestry. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to even hear her case in 1986. The ruling against her stood. All of this explains why modern DNA tests keep shocking people in Louisiana. The same 2015 study by Dr. Katarzyna Bryce found that up to 30% of white-identified Southerners in Louisiana carry about 2.3% sub-Saharan African DNA. That's the genetic leftover of ancestors who crossed the color line generations ago. They did it to escape the very legal system that Plessy couldn't stop. There's real progress happening now, though. Young Creoles are leading a revival. You can now find Kurivini lessons on language learning apps. Schools in Lafayette and New Orleans are starting to teach the language alongside French. Musicians like Corey Leday and Cedric Watson are recording whole Zydeco albums sung entirely in Kurivini. And white-identified families are reaching out to black Creole cousins. Their DNA results just uncovered these cousins. A century ago, their own ancestors were forced to cross this same color line, but in the other direction. But one thing may never be solved. French law blocks most commercial DNA testing inside France itself. That means the DNA databases scientists need are still too small. Without them, it's hard to fully separate old French colonial DNA from nearby British, Irish, or German ancestry. Some of this genome may never be fully mapped, and the oral history that could fill in the gaps is only alive as long as the elders who carry it. One important caveat here, because good science demands it. Some geneticists describe Louisiana Creoles as forming a distinct third genetic cluster, separate from a simple black-white mix. Real data supports that pattern, though it's still just one interpretation, not a settled scientific fact. Human DNA doesn't come in separate boxes. This pattern came from history and society rather than biology. A legal and social system made this population look distinct, keeping one specific intermarrying community together for over 150 years. That's what packed these genetic markers together. Without it, those markers would have spread out and mixed into the wider group. Every Louisiana Creole person alive today carries a genetic archive. That archive survived birth certificates, census forms, and Supreme Court rulings, all of which tried to erase it. It holds French colonial law, precise West African ancestry, and Native American maternal lines. Buried inside all of that is a Sephardic Jewish paternal thread. It hid under a Spanish last name for 200 years. If this population fully disappears into America's black and white racial categories, the country loses something real. It loses its only truly three-part founding population, and it loses the direct genetic proof of a French-African world that fought its own erasure for 300 years. The science has finally caught up to something this community always knew. Their oral history never left. Generation after generation, they kept telling the true story. And now, we know, memory can outlast paperwork. If this video changed how you think about American genetics, like it and subscribe. Next week, we look at a genome so isolated that geneticists first assumed it belonged to one simple single population. Then, DNA sequencing turned up something that matched no known human group on Earth. Who they are and what that DNA actually is, that's next on DNA Detect.